Hello, everyone. Welcome to another brief lecture for our Phil 101 Introduction to Philosophy class. This is a brief lecture on substance dualism, a very famous and influential view from the history of philosophy, specifically from philosophers like Rene Descartes and others who have had a very profound impact on the field or subdiscipline of philosophy known as philosophy of mind. This chapter also touches on a broad part of philosophy called metaphysics, which is the study of the ultimate nature of reality, what's real, what exists, things like that. So this is obviously a very consequential topic, and I would, as always, encourage you to have a go at the reading before listening to the lecture. But as you can see with my diagrams here on the page, there's a lot of connection between these philosophical topics and questions to things that we're grappling with today, such as artificial intelligence, whether computers can be considered human, so many different things that come up in perhaps our favorite movies, television shows, comics, novels, things like that. So there's really a lot to chew on in metaphysics and philosophy of mind more specifically. So we'll get straight to it. Okay, so we're going to break up the chapters from the philosophy of mind into each section or each individual chapter. So we'll start with substance dualism, specifically the kind of substance dualism we get from, as I said, Rene Descartes. And then in another lecture, we'll talk about the primary response or contrasting view to substance dualism, which can be summarized as roughly materialism and behaviorism, which looks at the human mind and human body in fundamentally different ways, especially explaining those things in fundamentally different ways than dualists do. Then we'll mention in passing functionalism. Functionalism is a more recent trend from the 20th century, which tries to take a path that takes the best of dualism and the best parts of materialism to kind of give us a new, more modern take or understanding on the human mind. And then we'll also very famously, or talk about a very famous topic, the concept of freedom of the will. Do we have free will? It's certainly a topic that's been debated in philosophy for millennia, really. And hopefully that's something that you've thought about yourself at some point or another. So before we get into all those fun details, let's just briefly introduce ourselves to the topic of metaphysics. What is metaphysics? As I mentioned, it's the study of the nature of reality. Now, for those of you who have never seen this word, we might think our first inclination might be, well, isn't that just physics? Well, interestingly, we get the terms physics and metaphysics from ancient Greek philosophy, notably people like Aristotle, who thought we have to separate the study of nature and motion into physics, and then the study of ultimate reality, or how to make sense of the physics, into its own separate category. So meta means beyond or above. So it essentially means above or beyond physics. What's the ultimate structure of the universe? Because we may be able to understand physics, but maybe we don't understand the ultimate nature of reality. That's what metaphysics gets into. And it answers and deals with questions about the afterlife, with God's existence, with the relationship between the human mind and body, free will. So obviously these topics have crucial implications for humans and our place in the universe. So we're trying to describe in metaphysics the natural ordering of the universe. And as I said, there's all kinds of questions that we can ask. What is there? What kinds of things exist? What are space and time? What sorts of entities exist? What are they like? What are the qualities they possess? Is there a God or gods? Is there free will? What is the nature of causation? So obviously some big questions here, right? And again, your inclination might be to say, well, science pretty much does this for us. But a couple points are in order there. One, as I like to point out, the distinction between philosophy and science really wasn't a distinction that was drawn as heavily as we do today, really up until the 19th century. The term scientist isn't used until the latter part of the 19th century. All scientists were called natural philosophers up until that time. So for most philosophers in the historical period, they did both science and philosophy, and they didn't think of it as two separate. They didn't think of it as two completely separate pursuits. They thought, for most of them anyway, in order to do good science, you have to do good philosophy, and in order to do good philosophy, we also have to care about getting the science right. So that wasn't so much of an issue for previous centuries of philosophers, because they thought that one was really a continuation of the other. Whereas in the 21st century that we have today, people are very specialized, right? We have scientists, we have philosophers. There's not as much overlap as there used to be, but I'd like to think that there is, because if you're interested, for example, in what is space and time, I mean, that's obviously a metaphysical question, but obviously also a physics question or a cosmology question, right? And so I take these to be great examples of things that can invite interdisciplinary approaches to solving some of life's deep questions. Okay, so I already mentioned there's a couple different areas of metaphysics. There's metaphysical cosmology, which, cosmology typically and understandably gets placed into the natural sciences, but certainly trying to describe the origin of the universe was something that has been attempted by not just science, but also religion, and origin stories that come from people all over the world, indigenous people. South American philosophy and cultures have many unique origin stories. We obviously get origin stories from places like ancient Greece and Eastern traditions. So lots of different approaches to trying to describe the ultimate nature of reality from so many different parts of the globe, every part of the globe that we can't catalog here. But what we mean by that term is essentially cosmos plus logos. It's an account or a story of origins, which is something that we get, again, in many different traditions. And it usually gives us a theory of how the universe began, which is called cosmogony, and is organized. So things like categories. What it's like now, features and laws, which again, we would explore more in physics or astronomy, and how is it fated to end? So again, even though many of these questions we think belong to the sciences alone, it's certainly fair to say that different cultures have produced different accounts or different stories for how we should think of the universe, right? How are things organized? How did the universe begin? How is it fated to end? So we get a plethora of different responses to that. So there's certainly a lot to study there if we were interested. One of the other major parts of metaphysics, though, is what we call ontology. Ontology is the study of the nature of being itself, or existence. And so this is ultimately a set of questions that tries to deal with, well, what do we mean by stuff? What do we mean by matter or things? Now, again, we think science tells us a big part of that, but science might tell us what, for example, what they mean by the term matter, but there's still questions about what that conception looks like that isn't just answered by reading off the science, all right? So this will be the kinds of things that exist and what they're like. That's going to be the focus of metaphysics and philosophy of mind for us. Okay, so why should we care about ontology? Well, I mean, it seems like we care about what reality is like. We're trying to make sense of not only our existence, but our relationship to each other. and our relationship to our surroundings. And especially as technology has improved especially over the last 100 years or so, I mean, that question, the question of what's our relationship to computers, to artificial intelligence, that's certainly been at the forefront of a lot of conversations, right? Not just in philosophy, but in everyday life. So these questions matter in micro ways, right? In the ways that are immediately present to us, as well as macro ways, those that are more removed from us. And we're trying to make sense of the big picture, right? What's the relationship between humans and the rest of the universe? I mean, we're trying to figure out if we're alone in the universe. We're trying to figure out, are there extra dimensions potentially? I mean, these are big questions that humans want to know the answers to. So hopefully you think that asking these kinds of questions is important, not just for us as a species, but for us as individuals, right? And we really, again, want to stress throughout this section the connections between philosophy of mind and science. Okay, so let's introduce a couple of terms here. So we'll start with the mind-body problem, and this is the age-old philosophical problem that tries to figure out or ascertain what is the relationship between the human mind and the human body. So it's the issue of what mental phenomena really are and how they relate to the physical world, because most people's intuitions seem to suggest that obviously we have bodies, but those seem to change, right? They get older, the hair gets gray, right? Things like that. Bodies change, but we still seem to have this continuous consciousness or mind that exists through time. So what is the relationship between the mind and body? Now, certainly psychology has a lot to say about that now, but again, psychology is a more recent human science, and many of the ways that psychology answers this question depends on what some really important philosophers have said that we'll discuss. So the responses to the mind-body problem are going to come in a couple different varieties. We saw in previous chapters trying to deal with big problems. The first response is going to be dualism. So dualism is the notion that there are essentially two fundamentally different kinds of stuff or substances. On the other end of the spectrum, we see the answer from materialism, and nowadays it's usually referred to as physicalism. And this is the doctrine that every object and event in the world is physical. There aren't two different kinds of stuff or substances. Everything can be explained by our best physical theories. Now, dualism has been a very prevalent view, especially in the West, let's say, and not just the West, but in particular, if we're talking about places like the United States and places that have a very large religious influence, dualism is quite popular. I would say even more popular than this view, in the sense that many people think that we have a soul, and that soul is non-material. That's a form of dualism. So dualism is certainly not dead. A lot of people still think that the mind and body are separate. They're two different kinds of stuff, whether we call the mind a soul or not. But I think it's safe to say that most scientists identify as physicalists. I think that's a fair assessment. Physicalism and materialism, again, we're using the terms interchangeably, is essentially that the mind and body are not two separate kinds of things, that they're both physical, and we can explain the mind and body, or what we mean by those, by our best physical and material theories. So we're going to see two fundamentally different responses to the mind-body problem. Okay, so we have the first view, substance dualism. So substance dualism is the notion that mind and body consist, again, of two fundamentally different kinds of stuff or substances, the mind being of non-physical stuff and the body being of physical stuff. We'll also look at property dualism just briefly. Property dualism is a more recent view that says that mental properties are non-physical properties arising from, but not reducible to physical properties. So for example, if you're a property dualist, you think that, if I have a mental state, say of an emotion perhaps, or of something I'm imagining, they might arise from physical stuff in the brain, but I can't reduce it to just the brain. There's something more there than just the physical explanations that psychology and neuroscience gives us. But historically, it's been substance dualism that has had the lasting influence. People thinking that the human mind is something that's non-physical, whether, again, we call it a soul or something like that, and it might even survive death, right? So notions of the afterlife are heavily dependent on substance dualism or something like that being true, right? Because our bodies pass away, but our soul, or who we really are, exists in the afterlife, right? So that kind of presupposes a substance dualist view. On the other side, we have materialist theories. We have views like identity theory. This is the view that mental states are just identical to physical brain states, or whatever we mean by mental states. That's just, for example, Anthony's physical brain state. So if I'm aware that I'm grouchy, or if I'm aware that here's a good example, that I have a headache, that might be my mental state, but that just corresponds to a physical brain state, right? That maybe I'm dehydrated, or maybe I'm, didn't get as much sleep. So in this view, it's material because mental states are just identical with physical brain states. We'll also briefly look at logical behaviorism, which has been a very influential view in psychology, as some of you might know. This is the idea that mental states are dispositions to simply behave in a particular way in certain circumstances. So if you're a behaviorist, then you think that the human mind can be explained by simply how we behave. We look at the way humans interact, and we look at how humans respond to environmental stimuli, and that's really the whole story, right? There's no need to assert that there's some non-physical or non-material being that humans are, when we can just look at the dispositions humans have to behave in certain ways, right? So importantly, here on this slide, we see the split between people who think that we should think of the mind-body as two fundamentally different things, or that if we should think of the mind and body as being of essentially the same fundamental stuff, or in other words, there's nothing non-physical about the mind and body, is perhaps the best way to couch these materialist views of mind-body. Okay, there's a couple other responses. We're not going to go through all of these. I'm not assigning every single chapter, but there are a couple other responses to the mind-body problem. One is functionalism. This has become a much more recent but popular view. This is the view that the mind is just the functions that the brain performs. In other words, we should just view the human mind as a functioning computer, right? We have inputs and then we have outputs. It's essentially algorithmic. That we should think of certain components as analogous to software and hardware, right? So when we think of a computer, it's got hardware, which, right, the physical aspects to the computer I'm using right now, the motherboard, right, things like that, video cards. But then I also have software, right, the kinds of programs that I'm running right now, like Zoom. So some people think that's how we should think of the mind-body problem, is just essentially we're one big computer. There's also another view called epiphenomenalism, which is the view that mental properties do not cause anything but merely accompany physical processes. Another way to frame this is we have a physical reaction, say, to smelling coffee in the morning. If you're like me, the smell of coffee in the morning is very evocative. But there's an experience there that's just not quite captured by simply the sensing process. But it's certainly related to the physical process, but that smell, that love of coffee early in the morning, that seems to be something over and above the simple sensory perception of coffee into my nostril, right? So epiphenomenalism is can be a tricky view, but it's essentially the notion that, yeah, mental properties do not cause anything directly, but they accompany physical processes. Okay, so let's get into Descartes. So we've talked about Descartes in epistemology, But Descartes is also very, very well known for advocating substance dualism. So if we're asking the metaphysical questions that we had before, what is there and what are they like? Descartes gives very famous and for many people very convincing answers that have influenced philosophers ever since. So Descartes again is writing in the 17th century. So for Descartes, there is what we call primary substance, and we can contrast primary substance with secondary substances. For Descartes, there's only one primary substance, and that's God. Descartes is a Christian, so he's a monotheist. He thinks that there isn't more than one God, right? Like the Greeks did, who were polytheist. God is the primary substance because everything else relies on God. And what is God like? Well, God is infinite, God is necessary, and God is unchanging. Characteristics that often get invoked when people talk about Christian theology. Not only that, God is the creator of all other substances. And God doesn't depend on anything or anyone else for its existence. But secondary substances are different, according to Descartes. There's two kinds of secondary substances, he says, minds and bodies. Now, minds and bodies are different from God in numerous different ways. They have, our minds share some characteristics with God, but for Descartes, we're finite, right? We're not infinite like God, and we're contingent. Our existence depends on somebody else, whether it's our parents or ultimately back to God. And also our bodies change, right? As I said earlier, we get older, things start hurting, right? Our bodies change in different ways. God doesn't change because God's a primary substance. But for the rest of us, mere mortals, we do change and we depend on other stuff outside of ourselves for our existence. So we might ask at this point, all right, Descartes, well, what makes the mind so special? Well, this is where Descartes would say, since we, according to Christian theology, were made in the image of God, and Jewish theology, and Islamic, so we should say the monotheistic or the Abrahamic traditions all think that to some extent humans were made in the image of God. Descartes would say God and minds both are immaterial. They're not made of matter. They're not made of the same physical stuff as another body, say like my arm or this chair or this table, right? Those things are made of matter, but our minds aren't, like God. They're also not indivisible, right? You can't divide the mind up in the same way that you can divide this table up or a piece of pizza, right? Because they're not made of the same stuff. Also, but they're both thinking things, right? That's their attribute. That's what they do. So this makes the mind the source of personal identity for Descartes, and it's been very influential. Obviously, this doesn't make us a god, since our minds are finite, while God's is not. So we contrast, according to Descartes, God and minds with bodies, because only bodies are material, as I said. They're made of matter. They're also divisible, right? Not just the human body, but bodies made of matter in general. You can divide them. And they're extended things. They take up space, right? So their primary attribute isn't thinking. Their primary attribute is just being extended. So, right, the piece of paper in front of me isn't a thinking thing, right? It doesn't doubt its existence, but it is extended in space. So this makes the body separate from personal identity for Descartes. And this is the basis of Descartes' view that animals were not thinking things, because Descartes just thought that essentially animals are little machines, like little robots, which is an interesting point, but we'll set that aside for now. Okay, so why, again, is the mind not like the body? Let's recap with an argument here. I think this is a good way to frame it. So Descartes says, going back to the epistemology section, either I can doubt that my body exists or I can doubt that my mind exists. So we should know where he's going from here. I cannot doubt that my mind exists because doubting, as we saw earlier, affirms my mind's very existence. Even if I'm being deceived, there's something there that's being deceived. But I can doubt that my body exists, right? Because we could be dreaming or we could be in a computer simulation. So if I can doubt that my body exists, then I am not identical with my body. I am identical with my mind. Therefore, I'm not identical with my body. Okay, so are there objections to this view, even though it's still popular among many or some people? Yes, all right. Notably, Descartes famously gets criticized for what's called the ghost in the machine objection. The idea of a non-physical thing, the mind, interacting with a physical thing is very mysterious, and psychologists and scientists, especially later in the scientific revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries, are going to say this is just implausible, right? The idea that you have a non-material mind or soul that somehow interacts with a material body is either mysterious and or implausible. Thus, the mind cannot be a Cartesian immaterial substance that interacts causally with the physical world. So this is adding on to this criticism, because it seems like we have, again, under the Cartesian view, this non-material mind that interacts causally, right? So if I'm thinking I want to grab this pen, then what Descartes seems to be suggesting is that I have a non-physical thing that pushes or forces causally my physical material body to act and pick it up. But how does that work, right? What's the explanation for that? Descartes actually thought, this is a diagram. If you've taken psychology, you know this. Descartes thought that the mind and body interact in a small part of the human brain called the pineal gland. And this is called the interaction problem. That as laudable as Descartes' attempts are, there seems to be a real problem here for Descartes, that he doesn't provide a very convincing explanation of how the physical and non-physical relate causally. Okay, so as I just mentioned, he uses this process of elimination to argue that it occurs, there's actually a place in the brain where the mind and body interact. But many scientists have pointed out that that's just not the case. Cartesian dualism is incompatible with modern science and psychology, which affirms a completely physical cause for every physical effect, or so the objection goes. One response to the interaction problem is given by this very famous philosopher. This is Gottfried Leibniz. He was a co-creator of calculus along with Isaac Newton, had a very famous celebrity intellectual fight with Isaac Newton, in case you're interested. They had very different views on space and time, but Isaac Newton, I think, historically came out as the winner there. He has a response to this. He argued that the mind and body run in parallel order, like two clocks that are synchronized so that they seem to be connected yet operate independently. So it's not that the mind merely operates on the body, it's that they're essentially just running in tandem. So maybe the computer analogy would work here, that we're running essentially two different kinds of programs at the same time in the background of, right, the hardware. That's one interesting response. But for Descartes, though, he insists that can't be right, because the mind operates on and causally determines matter, right? So Descartes' not going to buy this answer, but Leibniz thinks this is how we get out of this interaction problem of how the mind interacts with the body. There's another dualist, Nicolas Malebranche. He refused to believe that some incredible coincidence, the mind and the body were perfectly synchronized. What happens instead, he argued, is that God steps in to synchronize the body and the mind. So there were philosophers in the 17th and 18th centuries who argued, well, look, I mean, if we want to get out of this problem, then we need to chalk more up to God, that instead of arguing for some mysterious interaction between a physical body and a non-physical mind, let's just say that God gives some force or some impetus to this interaction, which is an interesting suggestion, but obviously not one that's favored in the 21st century. So let me leave this lecture here. I know that there's a lot going on, but I hope you're interested in thinking about substance dualism and what your own view is on the relationship between the mind and the body. So let me leave it there for now. Thanks as always for listening.